In the foreword of Brian Rue's The Stray Dog of Anime, he mentions how his experience with the dub of the original Ghost in the Shell film almost steered him away from the medium completely, stating, "It was not until a few years later when I decided to give the film another chance and watch the subtitle version that I grasped the subtle complexities of Oshii's filmmaking. I gained a new appreciation for the anime medium, as well as a renewed scorn for films that have been overdubbed in a different language. The horrendous dub of Ghost in the Shell almost turned me away from one of the greatest directors in Japanese animated cinema. I recommend that readers watch Oshii's films in the original Japanese dialogue with English subtitles whenever possible." Rue is not alone in his arguably extreme mindset, as many critics and diehard fans of the film have been quick to point out the numerous differences between both versions. Most famously is the scene where Bato asks the Major why there's noise in her cyberbrain, to which she replies in the original with, a joke that plays into the film's commentary on gender identity. However, in the dub, this line ended up being,
"What's with all the noise in your brain today?"
Must be a loose wire.
Even though some could see this as something relatively minor compared to the film as a whole, fans still took issue with the fact that any relevant subtext presented in the subtitle version was tampered with, and would rather not risk that again going forward. But just like how there's more to an anime than just the writing, there's more to any given dub than just the validity of the script, especially now when the whole dubbing process is much more involved compared to back when this film was brought over to the West. Everyone knows licensing companies start with a team of translators who take the raw Japanese dialogue and turn it into a rough English script. But what many people don't know is that this shouldn't be confused with what's presented in the official subtitles. Despite being seen as quote-unquote the next best thing compared to the raw Japanese anime by what many may call a sub-purist, a subtitled script is still filtered by an English speaker, who's changed the lines to flow when being read by an English audience. This way they can catch the show's meaning as subs flash at the bottom of the screen, inherently changing some of the intentions and nuances of the Japanese script, even before a dub is a twinkle in the studio's eye. What English-speaking viewers are getting is a tinged version of the show right out the gate. Meanwhile, the actual raw translation with no changes whatsoever that the dub script writers will be working off of still include all those miscellaneous untranslatable elements, such as broken English, impractical sentence structure, and honorifics. There'll even be side notes about Japanese cultural references, missing lines, and so on.
So we're working with the length requirements. It's got to be, 2 lines. We're breaking it up into subtitle-sized chunks, but we're also trying to write in a way that all of the information that maybe won't fit in the subtitle or just doesn't convey itself in writing but would convey itself through acting is still there for the ADR writers.
That translation is then given to people known as time coders, who watch entire episodes from front to back and note the exact minute, second, and frame of animation when each line starts, with a couple of words from the rough translation as a marker about which line goes where. Then, a scriptwriter is given this quote-unquote skeleton script and rewrites new lines that match the lip flaps. Sometimes these scripts pass through a head writer for approval, possibly adding their own edits if they have time or choose to do so, and only then is the script given to the ADR director, who may also make changes once it's out of the scriptwriter's hands, for reasons that can sometimes be as simple as making it easier for their actors to match those aforementioned lip flaps, or as complex as the director feeling like a certain line needs to be totally rewritten.
Goku is dead. You have to not just do a good voice, not just act, you have to match mouth flaps on a screen, right? Goku has gone to his eternal rest. Most of us are puppeteers, except you're the puppet and the screen is the puppeteer. Say it with a smile. Goku is dead.
In Japan, lip flaps are inherently less of a concern, since the most important thing to that audience is listening to the prestigious voice actors and appreciating the quality of the animation. In fact, if you were to watch a few episodes of a seasonal anime without subtitles, chances are there's less to distract you from noticing just how often the voice acting doesn't quite match their characters' mouth movements. Meanwhile, in English-speaking countries, out-of-sync mouth movements are usually seen as evidence of a poorly produced product, and are usually held to a much higher standard. It's a long-time stigma over here in the West, traceable all the way back to old Godzilla films where the mouth movements would continue even when a character stops talking.
You ever seen one of the old Godzilla movies where the words don't match their mouth? Did you hear? There's a dinosaur on the loose, right here in New York City. How does that make you feel? Are you scared? Come on, talk to me.
I'm not scared. I laugh in the face of danger.
So in order to avoid this, changes to the script will be made in hopes of not breaking the audience's immersion.
It's over 9,000!
In the Ocean dub of Dragon Ball Z, Vegeta's famous "It's over 9,000" line had such an over-the-top delivery due to an attempt to match the provided lip flaps. Let's play this clip back in slow motion. After Vegeta crushes his scouter, he has one open flap that lasts right till the end of the shot before it cuts back to Nappa.
9,000?
They tried having the final syllable of "thousand" fit there, and it's the seemingly nonsensical elongation that turned this version into a meme.
It's over 9,000!
In Funimation's in-house version of the dub, Vegeta has an added gasp in that final flap to have the dialogue before it sound less awkward.
It's over 9,000!
And it's the same thing again in Kai, but this time with the original number from the Japanese version.
It's over 8,000! 8,000!
Here we see the goal to match lip flaps as its own creative process, so sound and writing are closely interlinked when watching something in your own language. But then on the other side of the fence, there are those who would go so far as to say that they could ignore a dub's disjointed voice acting or poorly matched lip flaps so long as the script was as closely translated from the original as possible, fearing that any deviations would understandably lead to a much different experience. And recently, people are becoming more vocal about these changes whenever they can identify one.
Have you got a stick up your ass? Or are you one of those dumbass Gamergate creep shows?
It's no surprise that something as out of left field as this grabbed people's attention. In the subtitle version of the series Prison School, this moment was supposed to ignite a relationship between the characters Anzu and Shingo, which would serve to set up a future dramatic conflict. It wasn't Shakespeare-worthy, but it was at least well-seated and acted as a decent sort of drama. However, many claim that the broadcast dub treated this moment like a cheap shock, and the script itself hadn't gone as far with its creative liberties prior to this in order to make it come off as normal. With all the exposure this received, it was understandably changed in the official home release.
Have you got a stick up your ass? Or is that your pathetic attempt at talking to an older girl?
But at this point, the damage to some people's faith in the dubbing process was already done. Before, when a dub would be released well after a show was finished, the ADR team would have more time to get the full context of the story they were adapting and fine-tune the overall direction of the production. They also would have support from a team who would watch all the episodes for quality assurance before the physical release, though it's probably worth noting that these people are not traditionally actors or directors by trade. Now, especially with the rushed production for the broadcast dub format, they don't always have that luxury, so it stands to reason that a lot would slip through the cracks. And while it's important to note that the subtitles of any given scene could possibly be giving you a great English translation, technically what ends up being read could serve as a poor mirror for what's actually being said in Japanese, at least compared to how a native Japanese speaker would understand it. Regardless, with the possible exception of shows about gaming, mentioning Gamergate in almost any anime dub would sound jarring and immersion-breaking by default, especially when the only connection you can make is that this scene takes place in an arcade, and that's seriously stretching it.
K.O.
But then there are times where simple mundane statements can be perceived completely differently depending on the type of show that they're in.
私は女なんだが
In most other shows, this line probably wouldn't be reflective of an entire genre of storytelling. But over time, the phrase was considered something of an iconic cliché, found in a lot of Yuri stories where one of the female leads would point out the oddity of another woman falling for them, which would then act as a setup to the romance that will inevitably come to be. So naturally, a lot of people would be bound to react negatively if such a subtle thing was changed.
I'm not into women or dragons.
While the subline technically doesn't confirm the speaker's exact sexuality, keeping things just vague enough where a lesbian storyline could work, the dub builds Kobayashi's reaction as a punchline with an affirmation that she is definitively heterosexual, thus firmly closing the door on any future romantic developments. It also inadvertently infers the actions of other characters in a not-so-appealing light. Many argue Toro's romantic advances were charming in the subbed version because they could be seen as relationship building between two characters who could reciprocate each other's feelings. But now that the dub sort of frames a romance between the two as impossible, these same untouched scenes can come across as creepy and intrusive. Many people even went so far as to accuse the studio involved, Funimation Entertainment, of straightwashing the female lead and burying any potential hint of a homosexual story. But these statements can only go so far when placed under scrutiny. It's important to understand that the individual actions of the teams left in charge of certain shows shouldn't always define a studio's overall output. Funimation especially has grown in size so much at this point that having any overarching agenda across all their dubs, be it artistic or political, is simply not possible, other than of course matching lip flaps. Not to mention that the people who suddenly think Funimation as a company is anti-LGBT should know that this one line cannot immediately discredit the licensed and distributed shows that do portray homosexuality positively, such as Yuri on Ice, which aired just a season prior to this, granted under a completely different team. So then, let's look at the scriptwriter for this show in particular, Jamie Markey, a longtime veteran of the studio and someone who did actually admit to being responsible for this specific line change on Twitter. She claimed that she didn't want the characters to reflect any negative opinions on homosexuality, while being conscious of timing. To some, the dub line was promoting a heterosexual agenda, but from another perspective, the original line itself can technically be considered heteronormative. While it doesn't draw attention to the character's personal sexual preference, simply responding to a woman's romantic gesture with, "but I'm a woman," could promote the idea that it's fundamentally odd or weird for one woman to be in love with another. And for Kobayashi to specifically respond in such a way could feel out of character in retrospect, since she doesn't seem like the type of person to really care that much about what society thinks. When it comes to considering any malicious intent on Markey's part, we need to consider her previous work as someone who wrote the script for and had a main role in the dub for Yuri Kuma Arashi, probably one of the most openly Yuri shows to have aired in the past few years. I understand the desire for representation, but there were many who were treating this like the early censorship broadcasts of shows like Sailor Moon, which actively changed the romantic relationships and sexualities of certain characters on a consistent basis because it was deemed unsuitable for children. This, by contrast, just feels like an honest mistake, similar to the loose wire example from Ghost in the Shell, in that it's less likely to register as a blatant change for viewers who watch the dub first. However, when it comes to the adaptation process, a lot of things that sound natural on a scene-by-scene or line-by-line basis can still end up painting a very different picture in the long run. This can include very quick details such as how characters address each other,
What's the matter, Meryl?
how they refer to themselves, changing statements into exclamations or questions,
Sure. Can you sign it?
and even Vegeta's little grunt from before. These are all undeniable changes, but how disposable they all are will vary from person to person. You could argue there were better lines to use, like maybe Kobayashi could just draw attention to the fact that they were different species, but that might not have satisfied the amount of lip flaps, so who's to say what would have specifically worked in this one instance until the home release? But then, there are other scenes that don't feel nearly as subtle.
何ですかその格好。いつも言われるから露出度を抑えたんだ。どうかな。次は体を変えるといいですよ。
Throughout both versions of the series, the character of Lukua is seen as a soft-spoken airhead that doesn't always understand how people react to her rather provocative appearance. And in the Japanese version of this moment, she seems to at least be making the attempt to take other people's gawking into consideration.
それだと完璧に知女ですよ。
Jamie Markey also happened to be the English voice for this character, and gives a very similar performance to the original Seiyu, delivering her lines with the same toned down yet courteous energy. But this can be seen as an example of how the actual lines themselves can make a similar sounding performance take on a whole other meaning.
What are you wearing that for?
Oh, those pesky patriarchal societal demands were getting on my nerves, so I changed clothes.
Give it a week, they'll be begging you to change back.
Huh?
In the Japanese version, we have someone trying to take the uncomfortableness of others into consideration, while this version carries with it a weird passive-aggressive tone, like she covered up because she felt pressured to rather than because she wanted to. And while the punchline Toro delivers in the dub is actually funny by itself in a meta sort of way, it still feels out of place that a character who seemed to have no real grasp of human customs and how others perceive her appearance to suddenly start using modern feminist lingo. There are other examples like this scattered throughout the show, and on this front, it's easy to see why the outcry was so vocal after resonating with its rather heartfelt messages. Like the Gamergate joke, this just felt like a change that was made for the sake of it without really considering the type of show that was being dubbed. So what happens when we have similar issues in an anime that's not even remotely as heartfelt?
Of course! Where's the fun in forcing these jailbait tricks to read something decent? Plus, most of the freaks who come in here hate women, so seeing girls degraded gives them boners and makes them happy!
Well, maybe think about how these girls feel for once. Maybe they don't want to be debased just so you can sell a few more chicken wings to horny losers with mommy issues.
Check out the balls on this kid! Come in here and lecture me, you dickless cuck!
Boss? It's for you.
This scene from Hajimete no Gal was evidently the final straw for many people, believing that it was propagating this sort of we hate our fans mentality. But what's interesting is that, up until this point, the dub had actually been received quite positively because of all the obvious changes.
You ever play doctor?
Many fans enjoyed how the staff took advantage of their creative liberties right from the offset, setting a tone that was consistently more funny and entertaining than the bland presentation of the subbed version. There was no deeper emotional meaning that any modern Western phrases or ad-libs could water down, but this moment from episode 7 seemed to be what pushed the envelope too far.
Book day's been cancelled, you guys. Another win for you SJW millennials.
However, it's a lot harder to sympathize with the extent of that outrage compared to all the previous examples, because if we're going to entertain the thought that Funimation and the people involved are insulting all otaku that might be watching by using this show as some kind of tool, then you can't ignore the fact that the anime itself is kind of an insult just by existing. We're talking about a show that is literally about a horny high school kid begging a girl he thinks is a slut to take his virginity. A show where almost every other girl is a sociopath, and all the main characters' friends have been very open in their objectification of all types of women. People's anger seems more to do with the fact that words like cuck and SJW were used. Though, if this scenario did happen here in the West, then chances are this would be the type of language used. And one of the points of a dub is to market something to a Western audience in a way that they would be able to identify with. It's also hard not to feel bad for Jamie Marchi since many still blamed her for this incident, even though outside of voicing the main heroine who didn't even have a line in this scene, she actually wasn't at all involved as a member of the writing or ADR staff, bringing us back to the point that critiquing the dub team requires some scrutiny in order to effectively distinguish who is responsible for particular changes. Now, it's possible that any socio-political language or modern-day lingo will immediately ruin an anime scene, because things could become dated for people that watch these shows in English 5 years from now, and won't understand what these terms mean since they're often subject to change. I imagine it's like what would happen if a timeless icon like Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny suddenly started using post-millennial slang.
Pardon me for bothering you, fam, but did you say you were gonna blow up the Earth?
Yes, with my bay.
Something about it just feels wrong on instinct. Then again, it's hard to touch upon the factors that potentially go into an anime's staying power in the West, much less this one, which would have ironically been completely forgotten if it wasn't for the controversy. At worst, they're just going to sound bad to some people because they stick out by default. However, now it feels like some people are using these few examples as an excuse to demonstrate that all dubs are intrinsically bad, because script changes should be avoided at all costs. But how exactly does this idea hold up to other liberally scripted dubs from years gone by? Just look at the Yu Yu Hakusho dub, which arguably made many egregious changes to the characters, having them come off as a lot more sarcastic and wisecracking compared to the original.
That depends on what finger I use. Well.
Yet many people still put that dub on the same pedestal as something like Cowboy Bebop, which also wasn't exempt from script deviations.
It's too deep for you.
And while we're on the subject of politics, a lot of people seem to enjoy the Sarah Palin jokes in High School of the Dead, which also played with its trashy source material, but could something like that fly now in the current climate? Any examples of change could potentially register as misrepresentation or artistic censorship, so where exactly do we draw the line? Are we obligated to throw our hands up and condemn change in any capacity whatsoever, throwing classics or just generally well-liked dubs under the bus in the process?
Well, it sure beats arguing on Reddit all night.
The problem with that logic is how it becomes a two-way street when playing with extremes. Some suggest that we boycott products and demand line fixes for these previously stated reasons. But nobody's going to boycott the Ghost Stories dub, even though it consistently cracks jokes at the expense of organized religion, black people, and the mentally disabled.
I hope to God you're adopted.
It's touted as a classic dub because fans know these changes were supported by the Japanese staff. But does that mean people would change their minds on a dime if anyone on the Japanese side of Prison School, Dragon Maid, or Hajimete no Gal stepped forward and said they were comfortable with the differences? Would that be all it takes? Being curious about an artist's intent is only natural, but what happens when it's used as an excuse to not form your own opinion? Discussion can only go so far at this point, and more it sounds like what people want is to be able to download the Japanese creators' exact thoughts directly into their brain a la Ghost in the Shell, as if that's the only indisposable thing about any work of art. Maybe Brian Rue would agree with this approach, but you know who I don't think would? Mamoru Oshii himself, the director of the original Ghost in the Shell film, who doesn't appear all too bothered by the fact that the dubs of his works aren't one-for-one experiences when paired alongside the Japanese. In fact, he almost seems to argue they shouldn't.
言葉っていうのは、なんていうか、翻訳できないですからね。だから当然日本で作ったものとは別のものになるだろうな。それは僕らがアメリカやヨーロッパの映画を見るときに向こうのお客さんと同じ映画を見てるとは限らない。習慣も違うし、言葉の持ってる意味も微妙に違うし、それを言葉が翻訳できるっていうのは当然そうだと思います。だから当然違う映画になるだろうなと思うけども、それは全然構わない。なぜかといえば映画は例えば5年後とか10年後に見たときに当然前見た人にとっても違う映画になるはずなんで、映画っていうのはこれだっていう実態があるわけじゃないんですよね。
Nowadays, numerous films and television shows are dubbed over almost every day in various different languages, and the belief that what gets produced is always going to serve as an exact mirror to the original might at times have to do with the fact that we've been spoiled on receiving anime more directly from Japan than we ever have in the past. Within just an hour of the local TV broadcast, shows go up on a professional streaming site that specializes in Japanese anime, complete with subtitles and in high definition. Meanwhile, comments and interviews from its creators, animators, seiyus, composers, and so on can be translated, published, and promoted during the show's run. We're at that point where, within a day of an episode's airing, everyone knows who animated the best cuts. Not only do we get exposed to the sub version first, but we feel so plugged into how anime gets made that it's hard not to feel like we're in the creator's direct audience. Maybe that's why people seem to think that a so-called exact translation would be best. It's a mindset that fundamentally views the Japanese side as a group of individual artists, and anything else, including the English ADR team, as a mass of uncreative middlemen. However, Oshii makes the point that it's impossible for anyone to have anything even remotely close to a pure experience with a work. He acknowledges that dubs are adaptations made by people who interpret his works, the same way that he interpreted the work of the original manga the film was based on, or the way that an animator might interpret the storyboards for a show that they were given. Changes in a script aren't as simple as flipping a switch, and in theory, there's as much potential for something to go well as there is for it to go south. But it's the why and how these dubs do or don't work that makes talking about them so necessary in the first place.
Folks who don't believe in the ghost will never know madness, schizophrenia, or a million other things inherent in the human condition. So if you're looking to prove your own existence, you can find as many ways as there are ghosts.
If there's one thing we should be able to take away from all these examples and controversies, it's that sometimes not every person has the same vision as far as the industry and where it should be headed are concerned. Because, as easy as it would be, you can't boil down all people who work on dubs under the same creative banner. Just a few years ago, many people made similar statements about animation studios, immediately assuming what to expect from a show's technical quality based on what company name was attached to it before even looking at any staff list. But now we have a whole Sakuga community who treats animators and artists as creative teams, examining their consistencies across individual cuts of individual episodes of individual shows. So why can't we have something similar to ADR? At the end of the day, a company is just a building. So if we do want to understand or criticize a certain written line, then we need to bring it to that individual level. But the issue is that any given dub passes through so many hands to the point where identifying a common element within a dub team can sometimes be off base as to who actually made a change or judgment call. If you're not interested in dubbing or refuse to take it seriously, that's also fine. Just don't use all this to solidify your own bias against it under the guise of pretending to know what's best for other people. Thinking that these select lines in these select shows are proof that all dubs are inherently failures would be like saying the inverse, that Cowboy Bebop redeems every bad dub ever made, and we all know that it doesn't. Not every dub is going to be put on the same pedestal as the original, and there are going to be some writers or directors that make outlandish decisions because they honestly believe that there's no point in trying to make something that they already know is going to be seen as inferior regardless of what they do. But then there are others who try to make something that's just as good, if not better, than what they were given. And these are the ones a lot more open to hearing fans out on what they can improve upon than some people give them credit for. The only way to understand the differences between these people, though, is to get your hands dirty and dig into the details. The fans who end up providing criticism that staff members will be willing to take at face value won't be the ones who nebulously criticize an entire industry based on conspiracy theories. Neither will it be ones who treat any deviation from the subbed version as an inherent flaw. Rather, it'll be those who actively care about anime ADR as a creative field, and not a filter. And it's not because we think anime dubs are above criticism. Quite the contrary. We want writers, actors, and directors to continue honing their craft, and I'm glad there actually isn't always just one set standard to abide by, because sometimes things need to be approached on a case-by-case basis. It's impossible to always predict why anime dubs change the original script, because there's no uniform answer. Not everyone who works in the industry will have the same goal or approach during the process. But the fact that there's a discussion worth having about what changes did work in certain shows and which ones didn't should be a testament worth celebrating, not condemning. There are plenty of dubs that we don't like for similar reasons mentioned in this video, but there are just as many that we love because they managed to craft an identity that resonated. The English lines, roles, and voices we think are good are also the result of tiny little changes accumulated to create characters and stories, rather than translations. The script adaptation process isn't going to work 100% of the time, so when something like this does happen, we want people to be vocal about what they don't like, but more importantly, why they don't like it. Because it's only when we have these types of conversations that any real improvements can actually be made. So with that said, what do you guys think about script changes in anime dubs? Which dubs with apparent script changes are your favorites or least favorites? Are there any particular ADR staff members that you're usually on the lookout for? Leave your answer down below and let's get this conversation going. Bear in mind that all opinions in this video belong to Eric and Abi, main writer and editor of the cartoon Cypher respectively, but huge thank you to Marissa Lenti for fact-checking us on the technical aspects of the dubbing process. Be sure to follow us all on social media, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more content like this in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time.